I know we're going to have some folks coming in from Rejoice. So I'm just going to start with kind of a general introduction. I think I know pretty much everybody here, but my name is Sam Simpson, and I am the big shoes to fill, which I can't, of trying to fill in for Chip today. And I was excited when Chip asked me because I used to teach the young men's class for years, and haven't taught in a while. So you guys are the guinea pigs. I apologize for that. It has been not only a while since I taught, but it's been a long time since I prepared. So my style is generally discussion, which would love for you to chime in, but that never happened once in the 10 years I taught the young men's class. So I'm not expecting it. My background is I grew up in Raleigh and grew up in a very conservative, almost Baptist type atmosphere. So the Bible was the literal Word of God. Every quotation mark was inspired by God. You were born again, and you were given the Holy Spirit, which allows you to read that God-given Word, and it may say something to you that's totally different from what it says to me. And so, with that background, I did what you should never do, which is I went to Chapel Hill and became a religious studies major. And my father hated it. It was an abomination that I had a Jewish, a Hasidic Jewish New Testament professor. He couldn't understand that. But it turned out to be the greatest thing in the world because it did exactly what this study is doing for us, which is it gave me a Jewish context to what I call the New Testament, which I had never had. I'd always interpreted it as what it meant to me, and I saw it through the lens of my own personal context and history and daily activity and my future, for that matter, right? So what this study does, which I think is spot on and is a gift to Christians today, is to be able to understand the context in which the writers and the original hearers of these letters, or of the Psalms, of the Proverbs, next week of the Gospels, what they were hearing and what they were saying within their own very Jewish context. So that can be boring to folks initially because it involves a lot of history. It involves some analysis. But to me, if we truly want to get back to what Paul is saying, we have to understand that. And then that opens up the door for us to say, okay, what does that mean for us today? What does it mean for the future in a whole new way? And I think Galatians is how many of you had a chance to read Galatians? And don't be afraid. It's almost better if you did. But if you had a chance to read it before today's lesson, what do you think is going on in Galatians? And again, rhetorical or not, if you want to, why did Paul write this letter to this church that he had visited before? Now, if you had asked me that when I was in high school, I would have said Paul had gone and had taught that you were saved and justified by faith in Jesus Christ, and that people had come behind him and had taught something different. They said, no. That's all kind of true, but you still need to follow Jewish law. The Torah was God's gift to his people, and now you're part of that group, which is great news. But you still need to be circumcised. You can't eat certain types of food. You can't touch certain things. You still got to be holy. And Paul is now writing this letter and saying, no. The only thing that matters is your belief in the gospel. That's exactly what I would have said. And I think to a certain extent, there's some truth to that, but that's not all that's going on. In fact, there's a lot less going on. What had happened is that Paul had started this church, and he had told them the exact opposite. He was like, the law served a purpose, but that time is over. And the law gave us the gift of the Messiah, but that time is over. And what this has done is it's brought all of history and all of creation to this wonderful eschatology where the Messiah has come, and there are now no distinctions between anybody. And there's a passage in the 3rd chapter of the 28th verse where, and spoiler alert, Jill quotes this in her sermon this morning. And she said, Paul writes, for in Christ there are no longer Jew or Greek, there are no longer slave or free, there is no longer male or female, for all of you are one in Christ. And if you belong to Christ, you are part of Abraham's offspring and heirs to the promise. And so that's kind of our hint that Paul is not really just writing a set of rules for you to follow today. He's kind of putting you on alert that he stands before you as a Jew, as part of God's chosen people. And all of history, from Genesis through Moses, Noah, Abraham, through the kings, through the time of exile, has been leading up to this point. And we are now living in this new age. So he starts the letter. It's hard for me to say the letters, although in the last chapter he says, look at what big letters I'm writing to you in, because he's have you ever gotten a text where somebody sends you in all caps? And you're like, okay, they're upset about something. That's kind of what Paul's doing here. But so this is absolutely a letter. Paul begins the letter with, essentially, he begins it with a few verses, and he could have stopped right there, because that is kind of the cliff notes of everything Paul believes. And then what Paul always does is he goes through and he unpacks that. And the dense statements that you get in the beginning of one of his letters are usually passed over. Usually kind of go, oh yeah, God is acting through Jesus, he's Lord of the world, okay, I got it. Let's get to the meat of it. What he's saying there is so profoundly anti-Jewish, anti-Roman for the time, that it's why they all end up getting killed. And so he starts out by basically saying, it would be like if, I'm not going to get political, but there's no way to not get political when you're thinking about what was going on in the Middle East back then or today. But it would be as if a Palestinian was standing in the middle of Jerusalem screaming that there is no God other than Allah. That the Jerusalem authorities have absolutely no power over any Palestinians, and that their allegiance is solely to Allah, who is now King and Lord over the universe. That's going to get a reaction, right? And that's what Paul is doing. That's what the apostles are doing. That's what the Christians are saying. Because if we remember, the Jews were given Torah, they were given the land, they built the temple, they were given all of this by God. And then we watch them through what we call the Old Testament, and they get it right, and then they totally screw it up. And then somebody has to come along and say, and they're going along, they're doing great, and then boom, they screw it up again, and then they get invaded, and they're overruled, and the temple's destroyed, and then they start to get things right again, and then boom, here come the Assyrians. And so, if you are Jewish at the time, you have a history of, gosh, we almost got it right, but then we screwed it up again. What are we doing? And so, Judaism evolves over this period of time to try to answer that question. And Paul tries to put that in light by saying, when Abraham was given the promise, there was no law, there was no Torah, there was nothing. That didn't invalidate God's promise to make Abraham's offspring a nation that would recreate the world and will return the world to the state that we started in Genesis, where everything's in harmony, man's in harmony with God, everything's right. And that's what the Jews wanted. They were like, how is this going to happen? Well, they went, okay, golly, we need the law. We need to preserve ourselves because we're kind of getting mixed in with all these other tribes and these other people that worship all these other gods. What if we just kind of start saying, we're only going to eat with certain people, we're only going to marry certain people, we're only going to, we're not working on the Sabbath, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. And all these rules set to kind of preserve their culture, their race, their identity, right? And so what Paul is saying is, that's evolved. And when he was Saul, he was persecuting people who weren't keeping that Torah, who weren't keeping those rules, who were so busy trying to put food on the table, they didn't have time to observe the Sabbath. They had to work. They were so hungry, they had to go buy food that had been sacrificed to idols. That was unclean. And so you've got this period where you've got groups within the call it Palestine, and you've got people like Paul that are running around trying to enforce the Jewish way of life and arresting people who aren't, and especially this new group of people, these new group of Jews called Christians, who are actually letting non-Christians in to their synagogues. And then you've got other people that are like, look, I ain't got time for this. My kids are starving. I'm working 2 jobs now. I can't make ends meet. You've got another group that lives in the temple, and they're the aristocrats. They're the rich guys. They're the guys that are benefiting from the whole system of sacrifice. And another spoiler alert, when Jesus saw what the temple had become, instead of a place where God dwells on earth and mercy is handed out and justice is served, he sees it as a place of commerce. And so he goes in there, and it'd be like if somebody walked into the Harris Teeter and bashed up all the cash registers. What happens? You shut it down. And so he was destroying the temple, not by taking all the stones apart. He was like, the temple's just a cash register for you guys. Let me show you how quickly I can shut this place down. Just dump this table over where all the money's being changed. All business came to a stop. All of it. So you've got people like the Pharisees who are running around and kind of enforcing a moral code on people, and they're saying, hey, you're not doing a good enough job, you need to do this. They're kind of the judgmental people, right? And so you had all these things happening in this time, and then you've got the last group, I would say, are the people who are like saying, all right, we're tired of these Romans taking over the land that God gave us. They're defiling the temple by having centurions in there. We're waiting for a military leader to rise up and to lead us, and then we'll throw these Romans out. We're looking for that Messiah. And the fascinating thing that one of the more fascinating things I learned when I went to Chapel Hill was there were a lot of Messiahs. Jesus was not the only Messiah for the Jews. There were tons of them. And some of them were just fierce military leaders. Some of them were just great teachers. But every time somebody got really popular and got a little following, they're like, oh, the Messiah's here. Next thing you know, he gets killed, right? So Jesus was not unique in the fact that he was one of he was recognized as a long-awaited Messiah. And so the question is, what's different, right? And not getting into next week. But for Paul, there was something really different about this Jesus guy, right? And so that's really the message of Galatians. Paul is saying, look, I was the Jew of Jews. I was super Jew. I was the most zealous of zealous Jews out there. I enforced everything. I was throwing people in jail. I lived as clean a life as you could lead. And then I'm going to Damascus one day, and all of a sudden, I see the risen Jesus Christ. Or he says Jesus. What does that mean? For Paul, the messianic hope was that the Messiah would rise up, would throw the Romans out of the Holy Land, reestablish the kingdom, bring in all peoples through the promise that was given to Abraham. And what would happen at that time is God would basically raise up all the righteous who had died before them. And you think about Hanukkah, when the Maccabees are being killed and tortured in the temple, they're kind of taunting their torturers and saying, do what you want to with me. God's going to reknit me back together and raise me up. Doesn't matter. You can cut me, you can mutilate me, you can do whatever you want to do. It does not matter. And so, where we are with Paul in Damascus is not that he sees a ghost, or he sees a vision, or he has a dream, or something. For him, there's no doubt he saw the resurrected Christ, just like the disciples did in the Gospels. He doesn't see kind of an apparition. There were words for ghosts, there were words for everything. What he saw was the powerful revolutionary idea that God had acted to raise up the righteous. And so for Paul, that's not a one-off event. That's history coming to its climax that they had been waiting for forever. And it's so powerful that Paul ends up just like the rest of the disciples. They're not just, wow, I had this wonderful feeling and warmness all over. Gosh, I feel like I love Jesus now and I've got him in my heart. It's, holy cow. God has raised up not just all of the righteous, but the one righteous. And so now we are living in a completely different time. This is not, okay, Jesus is up in heaven with God, and now we can pray to him, we can ask him in our hearts, and we can be born again, and we can be nicer people. This is, all of history has come to its climax. And we are now living in between that climax and the final recreation. And so, that's the only way you can explain people being crucified upside down, being willing to be stoned to death. I mean, C.S. Lewis used to famously say, either they're mad, they're bad, or they're right. Because you don't do that unless you truly believe that something cataclysmic has happened, right? And so, all this is going on, and this is great. He's established, he's bringing in the Gentiles, and at one point, he's feeling really good about everything. And then all of a sudden, all these Jews who have been converted to Christianity, and they wouldn't have said converted, they would have said, we're the true Jews now, right? They didn't look at Christianity as being some new religion. They were like, this is just where Judaism was going, right? And we realize it. We've got an obligation to say, hey people, you missed it, right? Then they come behind him, and they start telling the churches, hey, you really need to be circumcised. You really shouldn't eat with certain people. You shouldn't intermarry with people. You shouldn't do this. You shouldn't do that. You shouldn't do this. And Paul's like, what in the heck happened? Like, did you not understand? Like, this is it. This isn't a new set of rules for living or whatever. This is it. There is no more difference between Jew or Gentile, between races, between genders, between anything. And that thought is so revolutionary that people have a very hard time grasping it. And people who are in power feel extremely threatened by it. And it's so true today. If you look at today, if I want to subjugate or push my will on people, what do? Hey, Jack's different from Will. Let me tell you what, okay? So Jack isn't from the South, right? And you just think it's totally different from us, right? But you and I, we got it, right? Or, hey, I'm white, you're black. You're different. You can't understand my life, I can't understand yours. Hey, you're a Republican, I'm a Democrat. Whatever it is. And the world and the politicians and the church, I would even say, is trying to divide everybody up into a special category. I've got a culture. You don't understand my culture. You don't understand how I grew up. I mean, I am me, individual. You can't understand this. Sound like a teenager, right? but we have all these people like, yeah, I'm like that too. Yeah, let's get together. Let's do this. Like, we ought to change this. We ought to do this. We ought to do that. Hey, I bet I could raise money for those people. I bet I could get them to vote my way. I bet I could do this. I bet there's a whole, there's a movie to be made about this wonderful cultural difference that exists between you. There's a reason y'all shouldn't work together. You should work with me. And Paul is saying, no. That's exactly what the law did. The law was given to the Jews so that they could be seen as different, right? And one of my favorite theologians says, no, totally missed it. God wanted the Jewish people to take a message to creation and to say, I've just offended her. I knew it was going to happen. Fitting to. But and that message was about their Creator. To say, hey, don't worship all these other gods. You are human. What is a human? A human is created in the image of God. Why is that? Because God is trying to reflect His image in creation. When you sin, it's like you've taken that mirror and you've gotten it dirty. It doesn't reflect very well, right? But God needs His humans to reflect that image to those who need it the most. And simply put, that's what God wanted. That's why He created humans in His image, right? And so He chooses the Jewish people as His special people to deliver this to creation. And my favorite theologian says, it's like the postman assuming all the letters are for himself. It's like, we got this great message. Let me open it up and read. It's all for me. It's all about me, right? I don't have any obligation. This is my personal faith and my personal privilege, and I'm chosen. I'm special. It's like Joel Osteen, my favorite, because he's always like, "You're beautiful. You are special. You are wonderful." And you can just sit there all day and go, "This is great. I love this." It's awesome. Yeah. But I'm exaggerating, but that's what the Jews started to believe. And so the practice of their belief in God became all about themselves. And ironically, the law, which was supposed to be this wonderful gift to preserve them, became the means by which they separated themselves from the very creation they're supposed to be working with it, right? Can't work on Sabbath. Can't eat with people. Can't touch certain people. Can't marry certain people. And so it's like, you wonder what Jesus, and again, I'm stepping all over next week, so don't tell Chip, but when you look at what Jesus is doing, He's washing feet. I mean, that's gross. That's unclean. He's eating with prostitutes and tax collectors. He's touching lepers and healing them. He's doing he's walking through the field on the Sabbath, picking grain. You're not supposed to do that. And they all call him out for it. He's like, you guys are missing the whole point here. God didn't put you here for self-preservation. He puts you here for recreation. And that's what they were missing. So Paul's point is, are you really going back and saying you got to be circumcised? Are you really going back to all these food laws? Why? And their response is, because I want people to know that I'm a Christian. And when I don't work on the Sabbath and I'm over here studying, they go, must be a good Jew, Christian Jew. When I'm not eating with prostitutes, they go, must be a good Jewish Christian. And Paul's like, nah. The way people will know that you are a child of the covenant is by faith. Not by circumcision. Not by works of the law. And so, that's what it revolves around. It's how do people, Chip said last week, if you were in court and you were being tried as a Christian, what evidence could they show? Right? And it was, I think his father said it to him, which is great. I kind of can't believe my father can say that to me. But what Paul would say is faith. So it's not really as much how you get saved. It's now, then what? So if you believe, then you have this faith. And your life should be totally different for Paul. And it's not about what you eat or who you're with or not with or whatever. It's that, and this is the famous part of that relates to this church. At the end of this letter, he says the fruits of the Spirit are, and we go through all that. I can't say them, I'm going to be honest with you, but I should be able to say them. But he says, by contrast, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And how do you do that? You do that because you believe you are living in a completely different time. And that's the only way it can happen, right? Not by setting up some artificial set of rules that will make you distinct from other people, because that time is over. And so, I love this letter because it's basically, to me, today's warning is I look around and I'll pick on race, but I feel like when Martin Luther King was preaching, I have a dream, one day my children will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That's disappearing now. I think it's scary to me. I mean, we are now in a place where we celebrate differences, and it's all well-meaning. Just like the Jews that were coming in after Paul, they totally meant that this would be great. Look, we're doing God's work here. We always think we're doing God's work. And if you follow literally from Noah all the way up through Paul, usually we're wrong when we think we're doing God's work, and somebody's about to come in and set us straight, right? So, for me personally, I'm always going, all right, man, I'm doing great, this is awesome, and I go, how can this be wrong? Like, what am I doing wrong? Like, what am I missing here? Because usually, when you're getting excited about what you're doing, you're completely out of touch. I think that's happening now. Politically, our nation has never been more divided. Racially, our nation has never been more divided. Social, economically, the rich are here, everybody else is poor, and the rich are very small. So what's going on with that? And as Christians, we should be asking ourselves, what's the new Torah that's doing this? What law have we put in place? We obviously don't read the first 5 books of the Bible anymore and try to keep our hair long over here or whatever, do that kind of stuff. But we've got other Torahs. What are things that we institute that create those distinctions and that support those distinctions? And politically, I would argue, those are the most dangerous. And we think we're doing great. We think when we put people in categories, we're just trying to help them, right? it gets worse. Jill and I were having a conversation the other day, and it was political. And I said I'm a libertarian because I think the fewer laws, the better. And I was reading Galatians this morning. I was like, that's kind of exactly the message of this, right? Is that if you are a new creation, you don't need laws. You don't need the Torah. You live by faith. You have the fruits of the Spirit. And unfortunately, that's not how we operate day to day, right? We try to put people in categories. We try to, and with the best of intentions. And again, I'm not picking on Republicans and Democrats. I do that. I'm not picking on libertarians because we're the small ones, right? But it's what happens, and they become extremely obstructive to delivering mercy and justice, which is completely counterintuitive, right? And so I know that we have to discuss the past. I know that we have to discuss where we've been social, economically, racially, or whatever. But I was having this conversation, and this was with somebody else who's not here today, thank goodness, so they cannot refute this. But and this was a talk about the need to constantly rehash the racial issues of the past, right? I agree, you have to be aware of history or you repeat it, right? But Paul in this letter says, those who seek to lift you up because of distinction are actually lifting themselves up. It's an amazing insight, and it's really old too, right? So I'm constantly aware of that, and this person said, well, look, I don't know how race relations ever get better if we don't do this. We need to rehash. We need to understand all of this stuff, right? And I said, you know what? I got a 17-year-old. They have no idea what you're talking about. They date whoever they want to date. They're friends with whoever they want to be. If you go to restaurants now, they're really in a lot of segregation, right? And what's happening is the new creation is happening whether you see it or not, or whether you're helping it or not. It's happening. It's going to happen, right? Do we have a role to play in that? Absolutely. Paul says, quit separating yourselves. Point out, call out those who seek to do that. A great example is in the Middle East right now. Told you I want to get political, right? By the way, one of my favorite, my Jewish professor for New Testament, when we were studying the verse about where Jesus says, if any of you wants to follow me, you must deny your father and your mother. And we were like, what in the world? I mean, I like my mom and dad. They're pretty good people, you know? And a lot of times that's actually been taken literally. People leave and they go off and kind of join a cult, right? What he was saying is, at the time, you had the first Middle East terrorists were called knife men. And they hated the Romans possessing the land that God had given them. So in a crowded market, they carried a knife like this, and they'd walk up to Harrison and just keep walking. And all of a sudden the Roman soldier would fall down and die. And that was kind of the first forms of terrorism. And they were constantly, they for Passover, they gather together and they start getting rowdy and they start threatening the Romans, and the Romans would ultimately come in and have to put them down and kill tons of Jews. In 69 AD, I believe, if you can say AD anymore, I don't know what it's called now, but Passover, there had been an uprising during Passover. So the Roman emperor said, I want 100,000 Jews, I want 50,000 of them on each side of the road, crucified, hanging on the entrance, coming into Jerusalem. Let's send a message, we're not putting up with it this time. That's the world they live in, right? So when a child was born, the parents were constantly saying, You got to learn how to use a knife. You got to do this. You got to train. We're going to overthrow the Romans. We're going to do this. This is our land. Does it sound familiar? Very familiar. And so his point at the time, and this, I'm old, so this was going a long time ago. He said, it would be like a Palestinian prophet rising up in Gaza and going, if somebody strikes you, offer them your other cheek. If a Jewish soldier asks you to carry his weaponry for a mile, carry it 2 miles. If you want to follow my way of peace, you have to deny your own power. It's an amazing context to put all of that in. That's the world that Paul is writing to. And so for him to say, hey, there is no distinction, it would be as if the Palestinian Christians today and the Jewish Christians, and there are many of them, all got together and just said, hey, we're going to have a meal together every day at lunch in the middle of Jerusalem. And we're going to show you that Palestinians and Jews can live together. The thought being that people see there are no differences between Palestinians and Jews. The racial differences aren't there, right? It's based on belief. It's what Gandhi did. My senior dissertation was on the use of nonviolence as adopted by Gandhi from Jesus to affect change within the individual to become self-autonomous. So, Martin Luther King saw it, Martin Luther King Jr., and Gandhi saw it. It is a powerful program, but it depends on having no distinctions between any groups, and seeing that and believing that you're living in that time where it's here. That's the call that Paul has. Don't be the person who tries to set everybody into their own little groups. It's a power play for you or for them. Don't let them do it to you. Don't do it to them. So, we have exactly 17 minutes. I will go completely deep if you want to talk about justification, righteousness, works of the law, justified by faith, or I'll take a couple of questions. That's a threat. Any comments, questions, or anything?
Is your dissertation available, Bruce?
Yeah, I really don't know where it is because it's before computers. Yes.
So the first day, Chip drew on the board a graph, which was very interesting. I never thought about it this way, about the covenant, and then leaving the covenant, and then being, when they were ushered out of Eden, and then basically coming back and forth, just like you were talking about.
Yeah.
So it sounds like what he was talking about, and maybe I'm just putting words in your mouth, is that when Jesus came, it was a new covenant. And it was starting over again from scratch, just like turning off your computer and rebooting it. This is what we're going to use now. And it visually, that was what I took away from that first lesson.
Very common language to say there's a new covenant. My Hasidic Jewish New Testament professor, which I love saying, would tell you it wasn't a new covenant. It's where it was going all along. And what happened, the Jews thought that the Jews like Paul, who had been righteous, which again, I'll get into that in a second if you want to, but it's really boring, would be recognized as such on the final day. They would be raised up. They would be judged to have been right to the covenant, righteous. And those who weren't would be the unrighteous because they hadn't been right to the covenant. And God sits in the middle as the just judge. What Paul realized is that rather than all of that happening, God took himself into human form and did what the law was intended to do all along. which was instead of Paul finally getting it right and all his buddies, Jesus did everything that the law was supposed to do. And he was crucified by creation for doing that. But God raised him, physically raised him. I mean, the whole idea of resurrection, if you've never spent much time looking at resurrection, it is the most powerful concept you can possibly have, because it's a physical raising up of the dead. It is life after life. And it is not going to happen. And so Jesus is now inaugurating this new age that ultimately, when you end up in Revelation, which I think y'all will end up in Revelation, where heaven and earth come together in the new creation. So we're kind of in that in-between time. But for Paul, it wasn't, oh my gosh, yeah, I just saw this guy and I feel warm and fuzzy all over. There must be a new way to be saved. For Paul, it was never about being saved. You're either a child of God or you're not. You're either God's creation or you're not. The question is, how are you living? Are you living in a way that reflects your obligations to the covenant, right? Or are you unrighteous? Are you not right? And
I'm not sure if it was Paul or Peter with the sheep, with the unclean animals take and eat. No, I haven't eaten unclean all my life and then take it out. Again, the idea of the sheep with the animals that were unclean.
And Paul picks on Peter here.
Was it Peter?
Yeah, so Peter was eating with Gentiles in Jerusalem. And then a bunch of guys, typical Peter, right? Never going to change. He's always going to be the steady Peter. The Judaizers come in and go, what are you doing eating with the Gentiles? They're not even circumcised. This is ridiculous. And he goes, oh, no, I'm not doing that anymore. Yeah. And then Paul comes in and is like, are you kidding me? Like, what's up with that? So same thing. And so that fight is taking place. And, Peter was the apostle to the Jewish race, right? Paul to the Gentiles. And yes.
Mr. Simpson, do you see Paul's Damascus Road experience as more conversion or call of both? Where you're going?
I would say to use a New Testament technical term, apocalyptic. It revealed to him in a new way everything that he thought he understood about his God, and that God's timeline, to say, wow. And I don't think he would have used, we use conversion all the time, right? Paul would have said, God revealed his truth to me, which results in, what are the practical aspects? Conversion, right? Paul would say it's much more than just conversion. I didn't do anything. God revealed the truth to me of what was happening, and it changed my life forever, which is conversion, right?
You talk about the in-between time.
Yeah.
But Paul was convinced Jesus would return in his lifetime. So I view Paul like a man in a hurry. That's why he tried to establish all these churches. He's trying to convert as many people, save as many as possible, because he felt Jesus would return any day.
And again, he would say, when he's talking about salvation, he is not talking about a new private way to experience God. He is saying, I am showing you what God has intended for you and has done for you, and it will change your life. And why is that important? Because God's got work to do within creation in between this time, right? And Revelation, everybody refers to Revelation as kind of a big book on all that. It's really, look at Thessalonians. Paul gets very specific in other letters about this next raising up of all saints. And so he's got this idea that in the middle of time, God raised up Jesus. But there is this other time, and it's a very powerful idea that all of creation will be recreated at that time. So reread Galatians and think about, rather than thinking about it as, okay, if I don't have to be circumcised, I don't have to eat certain foods and all this kind of stuff, I'll be saved if I just believe. And then I'm not going to hell. That's not what's going on here. What they're saying is that people have a revelation about Jesus in their life. What does that do to them? How can you tell who is living in that, I hate to use the word new covenant, but I'll use new covenant, in that covenant? Now that as a Gentile, I'm let in, how can you tell if I'm a Christian or not? If I go to court? It's not by eating circumcision, blah, blah. It's whether I have faith and my life reflects that. So, Paul is not letting anybody off on the works. You gotta do works. What are those works? They're a lot more difficult than eating certain foods and not being with people. They're seeing the world as being recreated. You're hearing a story, and it's a great story, but you're being invited to participate and be an active role in it, which means dropping all your prejudices, all your desire to put people in boxes here and there, to see people as clean or unclean or dirty or homeless people that are, like we used to stay at the homeless shelter, and every time I brought somebody new to spend the night, they would go, "Whoo, I thought that was going to be a lot worse. Those guys really aren't bad, I mean, I thought it was going to be terrible, and that's it. There really ain't a difference.
I heard it as dethroning yourself.
Yes. And he would say, I've died to Christ, but I've been raised up in Christ. So it's that. And again, anytime you hear the word raised up in the Bible, think resurrection. Baptism is a symbol for resurrection. It is central to everything the Jews thought, because it is not just this wonderful get out of death free card. It is recreation, which is what God has intended through his people all the time. That is the densest theology you've ever had of Galatians. It's probably more than you wanted. I apologize if it was. But do me a favor, go back and read Revelations. It'll take you 20 minutes with this in mind, and try to lose the lens that I used to come to it with. This is all about people who think they can save themselves by doing good works, and people who say, no, all you got to do is pray that magic Billy Graham prayer and you are saved, right? I used to always tell Sid Batts, I'm not a big believer in hell, because I think it distracts everybody from what we're really supposed to be doing, which is the here and now. We're living in a story. We are being invited to participate in that. And the question is, how are you doing? And that's what Paul wants to see. He wants to see not circumcision, not separation, but the fruits of the Spirit, the faith that you have now that you believe. Yes.
So remember, with Sid being our senior pastor, every Sunday we said the fruits of the Spirit.
Exactly. And I still can't say it. All right. Any last comments or questions?